And thank you, Larry, for praying us in. And for those that I've not really met, or kind of sort of just for the recording, I'm Altagracia Perez-Bullard. I have the privilege of serving here at Virginia Theological Seminary. I am the Associate Dean for Multicultural Ministry and Assistant Professor of Practical Theology. And I was so appreciative that in October, Larry encouraged all of us at the convocation to consider getting together as areas. And our area had a lot of energy around the things that Dr. Kyle Lambelet offered, especially implications for congregational life. I guess we were a group of practical theologians in the room, and some questions around pastoral care, but I think our conversation can go anywhere. I did include the link to the video of the convocation with the numbers of where Kyle was speaking in case people wanted to watch that or review it. And then Kyle also shared a chapter from his book where these concepts are talked about for people, and none of that was required for class. None of it was required. It was all recommended, but we can have we're gonna, I think, invite maybe Kyle to say some opening things and then to have the conversation go where it may. My understanding is this is primarily for collegial fellowship, right? So we can do what we want. Larry, I don't know if you want to say some things?
No, just welcome. We're delighted this group can get together, and we have funds each year, and we are really happy to spend them. So if you crisscross over with another group in ethics or anything else, let us know. We'll see if we can pass on the kind of fellowship and collegial formation that we do here. So welcome.
I am Lisa Kimball. I too serve here on the faculty at Virginia Seminary. I am also in the field of practical theology. I am primarily in Christian formation and congregational leadership. And I also serve as the vice president for lifelong learning. So sort of the outward facing, non-credit bearing efforts that we often try to engage the wider church, with which we try to engage the wider church. And I sadly missed the consortium gathering, but I have caught up with the video and the article. So feel grateful that we can have this conversation, and wish we were all physically together, but grateful for the magic of technology in the midst of a world that feels very unsettled right now.
Oh, Larry Goldman, director of the Washington Theological Consortium, Presbyterian by background, one of the few remaining. And as we dwindle in size, we're smaller than the Episcopal Church now. It's quite stunning. We'll see. And I've been doing this for about over 13 years. And our recent kind of expansion or growth area has been in Abrahamic dialogue and a new certificate in spirituality with an ecumenical focus.
Well, great to be in the room. My name is Storm Swain. I am the Frederick Hauk-Busch Professor of Anglican Studies, Pastoral Care and Theology at United Lutheran Seminary. So lovely to see some old friends in the room. I just finished teaching a one-week intensive on disaster spiritual care, where I had students from across the consortium in it, which was lovely. We had about 10 students that were not ULS students, a little cluster from Wesley, from Virginia. I think we had a Wartburg student in there as well. But it was really nice to have a course that felt like it was a consortium course, even though it was a one-week online intensive, and I am still somewhat brain dead. But lovely to be with you all, and I might pass it over to the Reverend Dr. Teresa Smallwood, who is our Dean at United Lutheran Seminary.
Thank you so much, Storm. Hello to everyone. As Storm has said, I'm Teresa Smallwood, and I serve as Dean and VP of Academic Affairs here at ULS. I'm also the James Franklin Kelly and Hope Eister Kelly Associate Professor of Public Theology. I'm very, very happy to be with you. I wish I could be there physically, but in spirit, I'm there, and I'm hopeful that we will continue our collaboration.
Kyle Lambelet, really grateful for this invitation. My discipline by training is ethics and peace studies, but really grateful to be in conversation with practical theologians. I think of my work as oriented in a similar way, though not congregational primarily. So yeah, really grateful to each of you for taking some time with my work, whatever time you took. So maybe I'll just say a few things to situate the talk from last October and the book Presente. And then I'm really eager just to think with you and talk about the implications of the agency of the dead. So where I started the talk last October was with a quote from Augustine: "How can the dead do such great things?" Which is such a great evocative quote. So it's from the end of City of God, book 22. I think is the way I suggested we might think about that is a confrontation with our sort of imminent frame. So if we are pushing, too hard or real hard into the projects of demythologization, like our Presbyterians might want us to do, Larry, calling you out. We can really lose a whole register of human experience, human and more than human experience. And the movement that I studied, the School of the Americas Watch, is really a movement that's rooted in the presence and agency of the dead. So I've brought a few things just to share behind Larry. So next time Larry talks, if you're online, look behind him. There's a image of the Jesuit martyrs, the 6 Jesuits who were assassinated in 1989, along with their housekeeper and her daughter at the Yucca in San Salvador. And it was really their martyrdom that gave rise to this movement. Activists in North America learned that the folks who carried out these assassinations were trained at a U.S. military facility in Georgia called the School of the Americas, and wanted to express their solidarity, to call for change in U.S. Foreign policy, and so what emerged was a campaign with some very specific policy demands: close the School of the Americas, and also, but this rich liturgical protest. And so every year around the anniversary, November 16th, they would gather at the gates of what was then known as Fort Benning, I think it's now known as Fort Moore, and would, in liturgical procession, name all those who were killed by graduates of the school. And so I brought some crosses that people carry. These have the names of 2 children who were killed in the El Mozote massacre. And so reading all those names and then lifting the cross and chanting in unison Presente. And it's so I participated in that movement first as an activist and found it very provocative and powerful. And then when I went back to graduate school, I just kept writing about it, trying to figure it out, what was actually going on here. And I tried to write a paper about Emil Durkheim and collective effervescence, and that didn't really work. And then I tried to write a paper about Charles Taylor and the kind of festive, the continuation of the festive and modernity. That didn't really work either. So I just kept trying to work on it and really didn't figure out what I was doing until after I finished my dissertation. So one small research story. I had a Louisville dissertation fellowship. So I brought my kind of completed dissertation to that group and was telling them about what I thought I was working on. And what I thought I was working on was the forms of practical reasoning, tactical deliberation that activists engaged in this movement. So I was looking at how are they balancing the kind of demands of faithfulness on the one hand, effectiveness on the other. Is the split that has deep history in the discipline of ethics. And so I thought I was looking at practical reasoning. And one of my colleagues at Louisville said, I don't think that's what you're doing here. I think what you're trying to talk about is the agency of the dead and how the dead are conditioning the kind of deliberation that's possible. It was like, whoa, you know, just a slight like reframe that really shaped the whole revision toward the book. Was really thinking about, okay, what does it mean for the dead? What does it mean for us to claim that they are presente, they're present, they're with us? How does that agency condition a kind of practical reasoning, thinking about our action, but also a performance of discipleship and faith? So that was like having that reframe then allowed me to do the revisions to move towards the book, Presente, Nonviolent Politics and the Resurrection of the Dead, which if you read the big storm for the
there it is,
image, the chapter I sent around, or Altagracia sent around, is the conclusion. So, and that's probably the most clearly theological that I get in the book. It's an ethnographic study, so I'm trying to like make it legible to the people whose story I'm carrying. But in the final chapter, I really, with Ignacio Echeverria, the liberation philosopher, one of the Jesuit martyrs, really trying to develop what is happening with the crucified people, crucified and resurrected people. So anyway, that's a little about the book and the project. And yeah, so the question that I was asking in the WTC gathering in October was, what does it mean to affirm that the dead are resurrected, or that we believe in the resurrection of the dead, that we hope for the bodily resurrection? What does that mean politically? And so some of the things that I suggested, drawing on this research, is they judge our pretensions. So they show the project of civilizational progress is a lie, that but they inspire our hopes for ways in which we can be involved in pursuing justice and peace in the world. And they invoke God's action. So God is the actor that resurrects, even though we can respond to, participate in that work. So those were some insights from that research that I shared. And I guess I'll stop there and would love to just pivot toward the conversation that you all had last October, as well as this wider question that Alta has invited us to consider of what would this mean for us in our congregational settings, in ministry context? And yeah, eager to hear from you. How have you seen the dead show up as agents in your own ministry or your research?
So I'll just say about the conversation that we had in our small group. There were like 4 of us. And I think, because the whole presentation, the whole panel was on the Nicene Creed and how it's alive among us. And I really enjoyed everybody's presentation. I think there was a curiosity about what did it mean for pastoral care? Like, what did it mean as you deal with people families who are grieving? Sometimes or especially in contexts where there's like community violence, where people are murdered in violent ways that are experienced in a communal way, I think, because I think especially I can speak to Black and Latino communities, when a death like that happens in the community, it's not just, oh, poor so-and-so and her son. And I shared in the group that I had participated in, too often, in processions that would be done by the community, to stand with the family, to call for police, for justice in the law enforcement system and community, unless you don't call it community, in the institution of law enforcement, and that it meant a lot. It galvanized the community, other people who had lost children, were made visible again, because these stories happen so often that it can be numbing, and people forget that this is happening all the time in poor urban communities, which is where I served. And I said, and in a way that was interesting, in a way that I valued and that was important to me, it also created a community unity. So there were activists, there were church people, there were the people that lived in the neighborhood. And it was one of those times when African Americans and people of Latin American descent, marched together because they shared, I think in marching together, it was a statement that they shared this loss as one community, even though often I think people experience it, obviously, if you lose, especially a child. So we talked about that some, and they said they wanted to, I note that my friends are not here today, but they were really interested in what would this mean as they teach pastoral care and as they offer pastoral care in a congregational setting, to speak of the dead in this way. So just an idea of what happened there.
I have a question, Kyle, and I was fortunate to be in the Philippines for a few years teaching at a Christian seminary, and the experience that we would hear about is that those who have died are really present in both dreams and in experiences, and were you able to write about that in your book? Something which I have not had the pleasure to read yet.
Yeah, I don't really write about that.
Okay.
I mean, this is the context for my research was North America broadly. So some work on the border, and certainly there are indigenous traditions along the US-Mexico border that have a very active cosmology of the ancestors' presence, and but it came up as a kind of what would the Jesuits do question that impinged on the practical reasoning, but people didn't talk about agential encounters in dreams and visions.
Does this interest you at all, or are you kind of focused as an ethicist to say,
I'm really interested in that. I mean, it's so my context and background is as a very waspy, kind of demythologized person, and it's I think limits our capacity to it's only one register of our awareness and existence. And so mostly my work my interest in attending to, listening, engaging with the dead, started here in my research, but the further development of that has been really along the lines of spirituality and my own mystical encounters with dead ancestors, my mentors, my guides, my grandparents, people who have passed on, with the saints, with Mary, with John the Baptist. So for me, it moves in a mystical and spiritual direction. And I think it's just, I experience that first as a loss, my scientific worldview limits my access to that. And then I think for me, Christian spirituality then a robust understanding of the communion of the saints opens up that my access to that. There are other ways to access that. And but for me and my cultural tradition, that's the way in which I've been able to engage that.
I asked in part because there are certain communities we have in the consortium that speak of this rather regularly. There's an ethicist at Dominican House of Studies, for example, who spoke to one of our students a number of years ago and just casually, mentioned, well, we invoke the communion of saints, and we have special saints that we attend to, but their presence is real. And he talked about a convent that is now turned into a retreat center or something. And the runners of the convent go in and they find the beds are made. And they've seen, these kind of wispy figures. And he says, well, I mean, why couldn't they be here? He's just casually invoking this. But if on a more personal, relevant way, I do think even my very waspy churches, well, one of them is not. It's a church where I do a lot of pulpit supplies, partly Cameroonian, African American, and mixed. So I'm very grateful to have that experience. But the memory of parents or siblings or children, I think more with parents is what I hear about as an active and even present memory. It seems to be more common than we would think. And I've always thought about, about what it would be like to have a small group come together of people who sense the presence of those walls and what that would be like. And I'm sure it's been done, but yeah.
Storm?
Yeah, there was a whole host of associations that was going on for me as you were speaking. And I know my colleagues in Gettysburg would, speak about the presences in those areas. But one of the things that was coming up for me was, as I look at this kind of icon almost, is the kind of concrete externalization of this in our faith communities. And I just put in the chat, I think, just two pictures that remind me of that. And I've lost her name, but the former Renee Howard, Mackenzie Howard at the Church of the Advocate, with these murals in the Church of the Advocate in Philadelphia of, the kind of parade of salvation history that includes slavery and the kind of the white gaze of oppression. And I asked her one time about what it was like preaching in front of these murals, or preaching in the presence of these murals. And she talked about them being like accountability partners as she preached. And I found that really a helpful concretization there. In the church that I'm connected to on Martha's Vineyard, we have two windows, one of Absalom Jones and one of Bishop Burgess. And Bishop Burgess retired in Vineyard Haven and Martha's Vineyard. So he's part of our living memory in that way. But when most of the congregation don't see this until they're walking past it. But if you're standing at the altar, you can see Absalom Jones and Bishop Burgess as these accountability partners as well. So I was thinking about that. And I was also thinking about these concrete kind of symbolization or externalization that comes from the T-shirts for gun violence, often outside faith communities, but also at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. We had an exhibition during the War on Terror, I think it was called, of the 2,000 or so boots of soldiers that had been, of US and Allied troops that had been killed, but interspersed with kind of boots and shoes of Afghani and Iraqi citizens, including little children's shoes, and just what it was to kind of get the visual impact of that mass externally. So that's been going through my head. And this week, the stories of the Capitol police officers that either died after the insurrection on the Capitol or died by suicide following on have been the dead that have been present with me. So, yeah, these images are just all swimming around as you speak.
Dr. Teresa?
Trying
There
to
you go.
unmute. I am certainly intrigued by the piece that I read. And I so resonate with it from the perspective of my own experience and then my research, which has sort of moved towards alternative ways of worship and alternative ways of ritual because of the ways in which our current denominational response to transgender people, to LGBTQIA folk, seems to be scattering them and moving them out. And so this idea of resurrecting the dead or partial resurrections really appeals to me. And I'll tell you two ways. First is my own historical connection to the idea of conjuring. This notion of the spirit of the dead. And, obviously we're talking about conjure as a way in which we think about the dead coming back, the dead bringing forth some help, because you're talking about the dead saving us through a sobrino. And then there is this also very important, I think, connection between us being raisers and the idea of conjure. This notion that, there is some contribution. And I think it has biblical formation as you think about the great witnesses or the idea that there is some capacity for the righteous judge to hold court, and there being this great cloud of witnesses, the righteous judge holding court, and you're raising up those who can talk about what went on in history. So I'm very intrigued by that. And I think it has, beyond the sort of spiritual realm, it has application in the extreme and important and classic work of Orlando Patterson, as he talks about slavery from the perspective of social trauma and social death. And I'm very much interested in reading you in conversation with Patterson's work, because to me, Patterson describes a situation and then you give us tools to respond to it. So thank you for this contribution. It is rich. And I'm so glad that I was exposed to this part of it, and I will definitely be purchasing the book.
Thank you.
It's so good to listen. And so many things that have just been said were echoes of notes I was trying to jot down for myself, and you put words to them, both of you, and I'm deeply grateful. Interestingly, when I read because I missed the first night, so when I watched the piece and then read, the language of communion of saints was flying around in my mind. It wasn't in your vocabulary. So it was nice to hear you use it, because I felt the sense that that's the vocabulary that has helped me operationalize, I don't know if that's the right word, the awareness that the dead are with us, right? That it lets me, I don't know if it makes it legitimate but I feel their presence a lot. And young people tell me about that when they read epic narratives. The Harry Potter was the classic one, but where young people are telling me that, well, of course they're here, they're listening, they're guiding us. And the other visual I had when I first read this, Kyle, was the incredible, I guess they're Gen Xers, the young adults who have risen up out of, like, particularly the Parkland shootings into public office. And I have never heard any of those young people now in Congress running for DNC, vice, whatever. I've never heard them not credit the dead. Like, I've never heard them not name the peers they lost, or the children, or the families. Their sense of moral conviction is explicitly connected to the particularities of that experience. And they're irrepressible. They won't let it go, you know, and they're not just saying it's all guns that they are working to eliminate, but they continue to locate the motivation for it in the relationships of the voices of the people who can no longer speak for themselves. And so when you brought up the Storm, the t-shirts, I find great hope in the activism of younger adults today who may or may not identify as religious at all, but who are ritualizing this, what you were talking about, Kyle, that they're demythologizing our sort of sense of developmental linearity, is that a word? And they're reminding us that the past cannot be forgotten, and the future is ours to participate in and to take for which we need to exercise our agency. And I think your work, it just really makes me want to bring theology into conversation with public activism, because I think that the sense of being rooted in traditions as ancient as Christianity and others that warrant this kind of honoring are what will help us kind of break through purely political that is around power. Like, I mean, I'm not saying this very well, but I got very excited because I think I keep watching these young adults and thinking, what is it that gives them, that sustains them? And then you listen to them. And it's this honoring of something larger than themselves, but they don't necessarily, anyway. And then the other practical question I have is, when you use the language of practical reasoning, can you break that open for me a little? Are you going Kantian? Are you going, like, no, I didn't think so. Okay.
I hope not.
I hope not too. That's why I was like, okay. I was just curious.
Yeah, the way I'm gonna start with practical reasoning.
Yeah.
Back around, but the way I talk about practical reasoning in the book is a way of thinking about the goods at stake in a situation, moral and other goods, and then the appropriate means by which to pursue those goods. So the kind of paradigmatic scene for practical reasoning in the book is the activist deliberation about what they should do. And I have like a very concrete scene in memory of
Not moving.
sitting in a hotel lobby, trying to decide what's going to happen at the protest the next day, what actions we may or may not want to take. Everybody puts their cell phones, takes the battery out of their cell phones, puts them over in the corner. And that's the scene of practical reasoning and process. What are the, we want we have these concrete policy goals. We want to say something truthful with our bodies. We want to witness to the faith that we hold. We're also entangled in these relationships of responsibility. Someone is undocumented, they can't risk their deportation. Somebody else has a parent who is dependent on them for care. So those are the kind, like, taking into stock all of that and then trying to say, okay, what are the next steps? So that's kind of what I mean by practical
That's
reasoning.
what I intuited, but okay, good. Just want to make sure I wasn't.
But I think all that, just sort of responding to a couple of the things. I mean, I think a worldview or a cosmology that would suggest that the dead aren't present is actually the aberration. And, the kind of demythologized view of the world is, like, looking back at this now, I think, well, that's a very basic point, that the dead are agents. Of course they are. But it took, like, I really had to struggle against a lot of my formation as
The
a
dominant
social
culture.
theorist and my own kind of cultural inheritance and the theological, certain strands of my own theological inheritance in order to say that. So I think we can learn a lot from I can learn a lot from other traditions. I was just watching a movie from the Marvel Cinematic Universe last night with my kids, in which Black Panther was one of the characters, and his dad dies in this Civil War. And he says, in my culture, death is only a beginning. And it's like, even in this, very craven Hollywood presentation, the dead are impinging. And I mean, I think one of the things that opens up for me is, so there's lots of reparative ways, and I'm certainly trying to lift up the ways in which the resurrection of the dead can be reparative. But there are also, Johann Baptist Metz calls this dangerous memory. And I think it is actually dangerous, in the sense that the memory and agency of the dead can be reparative, but it can also be very damaging to our shared life. And some of the ways, I think we can all call up some things, but think about the way in which the memory of those killed in 9/11 was activated to pursue a terrible, military campaign of retribution. Or think about how in our own time, or a very recent time, the memory of the dead Israelis was used to carry out genocide in Palestine.
And called the second Holocaust by a lot of people.
So there's, or think about the Slobodan Milosevic and his campaign drawing on these deep memories of grievance, or even the insurrection. There's a memory of persecution that is activated for political motivation. And that's why I think, it's important to keep practical reasoning in the mix.
Not romantic.
What are these dead calling us to do? That's why we need to discern, with the community. That's why and even, thinking about being at a place like Virginia Seminary that has a long history, and there are dead here. Our cemetery is right over here. And these dead continue to walk in this space. And some of them are good, and some of them do not. So what do we do with that? How do we engage those dead in a reparative way?
She works here.
Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And that's the ethical way.
oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I'm just agreeing with you.
Yeah, I've been sitting here thinking about how not all the dead are charming. You know, I'm a white guy who, and I've told this story at ULS, and many places. But you know, my family comes from Southern Alabama. I was named after a Confederate war hero. I went to Robert E. Lee High School in Houston, the whole thing. And you know, growing up, being formed in that world, and we were a more we weren't militant or violent people about it, but it was normal. It was that was the water that we grew up in. And I although most of my family were farmers and working people and kind of lower middle class people, my ancestors, the recognition that boyhood heroes, you know, like Robert E. Lee, that the cousins that I talk with and extended family, that there's a part of the dead that haunts us in ways that debilitate us and kind of blind us to certain moral dilemmas. And I've had to wrestle with this for, you know, many years. One of the probably the only liturgical or prayer ritual form that I have found helpful about this is lamentation. And do you, and of course you may have written about it already. What do you think about lamentation as a resource that congregations can use, individuals can use?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, I follow Emily Towns's approach to lament as a reparative form, and my sense is that it plays a really important role in, as Altagracia was mentioning, with when these families have lost a loved one, to come together to hold that grief together. It provides a container for the unspeakable. You know, we can't speak, and yet the community comes together, brings words around those things, offers ritual, and we have you know, the Psalms are, it's really a book or a, you know, a set of laments. Lament is the most common genre of the Psalms. So yeah, and I think it plays a really key role in repairing political voice, political agency.
In addition to holding grief and naming wrong, either done by us or a community or me, or done to a community, there's a sense of, as Don Salier says, of reminding God to be God. You know, where are you, O Lord? You've done all these great things in the past, and a lot of the Psalms of Lament open this way or end this way. That raises for me a question about the how do we deal with the absence of God? You know, and remembering martyrs and wrongdoing and you know, grave injustice.
Yeah, I think invocation is one of the key functions of lament, and kind of resurrection hope is hope in God's action. It's one that I'm interested, I think, Teresa, you were saying there's something about some role that we have to play. I think that's right. And like, we can't do it. We can't resurrect the dead. And how do we hold that reality? I think in my research with the School of the Americas Watch and the Presente Litany, there was, I think, some just critique of the litany that people would come, was on their kind of annual activist calendar for 25 years. They would,
Same time next year.
yeah, shout their rage, and it provided this really important cathartic emotional release. And then you go back to whatever you do and move on with your life. And so I think some folks wondered, does that, you know, rawr, you know, collective rage, collective shout, is that politically effective? Does that get us what we want? And I think if it is just a release valve for emotional pressures, I mean, that's worthwhile, worth doing. But is it moving us toward a more just and peaceful world? I don't know. Or that's the, I think, discernment, practical reasoning question. And we have a, I think, responsibility to discern our response to resurrection. And that's really where the discerning where is God already active in ways that we might not have seen. And then trying to respond to that with our action. But I don't know, Teresa, if you want to expand on what you were saying earlier, I'd love to hear your insight.
I really think you're on to something here. And I don't know that I have an expansion, but I do know that this is worth our thinking more deeply about, because the reason I was really zeroing in on this idea of partial resurrection is because of the argument you make about God being central. And so, no, we can't raise the dead, but our witnesses can operate as witnesses. You know, in a court of law, you put on witnesses, it's for the purpose of making your case. And who are we making our case to? The righteous judge. So in other words, the resurrecting has the purpose of moving the hand of God. And the idea that the hand of God might be moved by our lament, might be moved by our praise, might be moved by our invoking the presence and the witness of those who have gone through traumas and oppressions and degradation and murder and all of these things, I do believe has the capacity to move the hand of God through mercy, through compassion, and through our own empowerment by the Spirit. Jesus says, I'm leaving, and you can't get what I'm leaving you until I go. But when I go, you will get what? You will get a guide, a comforter, the Spirit. And it is through that process, it is through the spiritual realm, I believe, that the power to change the oppressions, to change the social traumas. And I do believe we are largely living beneath our means. And I think presente gives us that sort of connectivity to a level of our means that we can tap into, that perhaps we have not tapped into or even taught people how to tap into. I don't know if that's responsive, but that's the kind of energy and feeling that you have evoked in me.
I'm curious about Altagracia's question about pastoral implications. This is sort of your territory, not mine. I'm eager to hear the wisdom of the room. Storm, I was thinking about your disaster chaplaincy work, and like, what would it look like? Would it be appropriate? I mean, I think that's maybe a first question. Would it do more harm to say they're still here with us. I mean, there are ways in which that can be very trite and, but what would it look like to call the agency of the dead in a catastrophe?
I do think that I like that idea that, I like that truth named, that, that we're living, beneath our means. And I would say that it's especially true. It's especially true of what we're doing in the academy, I think, in the sense that the culture of the academy is not benefiting from this cosmology, which is clearly not anti-Christian. And I think it's interesting because I think it's different in different contexts. So I'm real conscious that both I guess when you live in I guess in anywhere you live, whatever context, right? What is happening to people, the personal is political. So what is going on does have political implications. But in the ones that are outwardly recognized, like when there's police violence or when there's, gang violence, and I've preached at funerals because of the shared cosmology that assumes that the spirit world is right there, like that we are just crossing a veil, even though different cultures name that in different ways. I then have I can name that both in visiting with the families and in preaching at the funerals, because it's a shared understanding. And then it's about that interpretive work as a community. And if you're the religious leader or the person that's leading the ceremony, then it's providing some scaffolding for the interpreting of this in life-giving ways. And so when it has been outwardly political, it is about how do we honor the dead? How do the dead live on in our work and in our activism? And then when it's families, it is that whole, I learned it from a Buddhist, so I don't know if it's a Buddhist thing though, but that sense that when you are with a person that is dying, the care you give is the naming of their blessings, right? So a conversation about all the ways in which their life and the people who love them and their family, their history, is a blessing, so that the person dies surrounded by those, by those memories. And then I think the whole, which I've attempted to play with in a sermon and it didn't work. The sense of those of us that do Christianity, right? We allegedly say there's a lot of power in the word. And that's something that is shared, I think in other cultures, right? That you name a thing, it creates an energy that creates a thing. Like you don't name certain things because you don't want them to happen, or, people name things and people say, God forbid, or, just because the power of naming itself has an energy, could have a conjuring energy, in the sense that you're conjuring, like you are bringing them to mind and you're putting them in a space and they are here because we've named it. So I think that when so then in terms of pastoral care, just be with people, allowing them to name, lament, cry, right, speak. I mean, the speaking is important in a healing process whenever it happens, eventually. And then the ability to say whenever we remember the stories. But, I also come from people that like the 1 month anniversary, there's another service, and the 1 year anniversary, there's another service, and so like that sense that we, the people that have picnics in the gravesides and the people that, and then, the Day of the Dead, everybody comes back out, it's like, so, even though that's not my cultural heritage, I mean, the altars with the saints
Oh,
that
yeah.
include our ancestors is part of my heritage, but that annual communal celebration is something gifted me by my years of ministry with Mexicans and Mexican Americans. So I just think that like, but I don't know that I can do any of those things if I'm preaching in a white context. Like then I have to move to like, whenever we bring them to mind and whenever we remember them, which like is the truth, but it lacks enfleshment, it lacks embodiment, right? In a way that other cultures have, and indigenous cultures have them too. So, it loses something in the translation. But I've done that. I mean, I've, just reminding people. So every time we celebrate communion, especially those of us that are like high liturgics, they're there. Like we say they're there.
Yeah,
we
right.
say that they're surrounding this table.
Right.
And and I was having a conversation with Riley, and he's want to plug his presentation. He's doing a presentation through lifelong learning about mysticism in the Black community. And he and I had a whole conversation, and I said, it's real. I have struggled with the word mystical. And finally, because some things you don't get them till you get them, I realize it's because I grew up in a world where that's not a thing. That's just what is. Like nobody questions that. There's not a division, right? That it's like, I didn't know you had to get a title. Like it was the way that spirit was talked about, right? And those who've gone before and nature and all the things, right? Creation. So, but I do think that it depends on the culture, because how do you name the power of that? And sometimes people have done enough reading, in other spiritual traditions and stuff that then you can echo it for them. But it is a loss. It's part of why WASP religion is anemic.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's all these things that are in the tradition alleged, but are not, are not present, are not lived into. So, Storm, I love when your little hand goes up. Any cartoon, even the ones on Zoom. Go ahead, Storm.
Yeah, I just, this idea about the dead speaking, and, I come back to in Māori culture, when you're giving a mihi, when you're starting a speech, you greet the dead before you greet the living. And that sense of presence there, which, Carly, I appreciate you commenting about the disaster course, but because one of the things we were working out was how to have a trauma-informed approach, but also how to have a resilience-informed approach, and how to, on one level, let the dead be dead, and hear the voice where it's not just you're dead or you're alive, but what does resurrection mean in this context? And is it, just having a holy snooze that kind of gets invoked on the Day of the Dead, or, or the sense of presence that continues this ethical demand on our lives? And so on the Wednesday of the disaster course, I showed videos of both the clergy in Newtown, Connecticut, but the parents and who included some of the videos of the 20 kids that were shot at Sandy Hook Elementary School. And that just made it really alive for the students in the room. And so one of the things we were wrestling with was about the sense of what I call a resurrecting resilience, where resurrection, it's not everything's okay now. Resurrection takes into the account the death. And so resurrection comes with scars. Jesus doesn't just pop up all, Easter all jazz hands and Clorox bleach, Jesus is raised from the dead. And that, how do we see that and hold that? And what does that mean in terms of incarnation and presence of the dead, where you live into a kind of a kairos time rather than chronos time? And we often find that around disaster and trauma. It feels like time is different and space is different. And so what and where is holy ground, where that sense of presence seems more present to us. And certainly in some cultures, but I think there are spaces where we talk about, the veil seems thin, or that sense of the dead speaking to us in ways that we are called to account for our answers.
Think about white church thing, and especially in more southern environments. Although I was a Texan, I got a lot of southern smoozing by my family, and the a lot of white folks everywhere, I think, invoke Jesus as a real presence, first of all, right? And that's the one area of permission where it's okay. And we don't. The Protestants that I know don't really do that with Mary or the saints or anyone else in that way. But with Jesus, it is okay. So the precedent of invoking the resurrected one as truly present and even guiding me is a real thing for a lot of people. And it does strike me that one leverage in Presbyterian white Presbyterian communities that I know, is really around the supper. You mentioned the supper and the Eucharist. We were largely from a more memorializing tradition, although we have real presence counterbalances. Those are not what people think about. And but remembering is remembering. You're re-presenting to some degree, and I'm not sure we experience around the Eucharist as much as many communities do, but we have the language for it, and it's partly just saying this is part of our tradition. We don't have to be scared of this. There is a sense of presenting the great works of God and the whole sacred history, but especially Jesus. But I was also thinking about two other things, and in rural communities, and this may be true beyond the South, land is a memory place, and giving up land was always frowned upon if you were farmers or ranchers, in part because it was the family plot. It goes back 3 or 4 generations. They earned it, and we have to continue the legacy and live it out. And so there's a sense in which, my grandfather planted that oak tree or this, there's this, it's not that they are present, but the legacy of the land kind of carries their work and toil. So there's that of course is disappearing quickly in terms of where land is going. But I think there was some honor to that. The other thing I was thinking about, though, is family legacy. And that, for example, this abbot that is my middle name, he was basically a bootlegger in the war, and he got thrown in the clink a lot of times. He was just a private. Right, he didn't do any great things, but he lived forever, and he was the oldest living veteran in his county. And so he gained this kind of storytelling reputation. So the family was really proud of this guy. The sense of living up to the legacy of someone who fought, sacrificed. Yes, it was the lost cause and all that, but did his duty is a kind of living legacy that I want to live my life in a way that they are proud of me. And these are all highly mediated senses of presence. But unfortunately, and this wasn't as true in my family, but some families, they had colonels and generals and and even in wars since that time, or the Revolutionary War, and that was actually used as a sign of elitism. Our family were the leaders. Our family, did the sacrifice. See what I mean? It's used in a kind of status elevation way. So, there's a dark side to all of this. But I think there are ways that you still hear about the family farm. We went back to the family cabin, and some of those are 2 and 3, 4 generations there. And so you have to kind of leverage where memory is invoked in a way that says, the dead are more present than you might convince yourself, or that you might say in public, because but those are, it's like tiny cracks that I think we could be. I mean, the Presbyterian Church here in town, the old Presbyterian Meeting House, it sits on graves of colonial people, and George Washington's chief doctor is buried 2 feet from the church. But it would take some real doing to convince them that some of those people and some of the people in their own families and some of the heroes of even the Revolution, George Washington's wake was in that church, for example. The historians get it. There's a whole batch of historians there, which are really quite remarkable. But to move them to the point of naming and maybe invoking the memory of the dead in an active way, it would be fascinating,
And I guess I like the idea of, not that I like the idea, but that the importance of the community doing the scaffolding or the interpreting or the meaning making around what is it that we're doing is important because of the resilience thing, because it can also lead to a lot of fatalism, right? Like, well, we're all gonna die and God must have needed this child, and that's why, so that's why the work of, a faith community or a spiritual community that is interpreting it in a way that empowers, that keeps alive a legacy in a life-giving way and not in a depressive cycling kind of way
It's interesting because I was struck, I think I'm picking up on something you were saying, because you started in your paper or your remarks about, we look for the resurrection of the dead, because you were grounding it in the creed. And I was thinking that, as you were talking particularly, that in dominant cultural churches in this country, so pretty much WASPy churches, in my experience, there's a whole antecedent piece of work that has to be done, which is to even deal with death. I mean, work to look for the resurrection of the dead means we even acknowledge that people die and that something happens, is inevitably going to happen to our mortal bodies, right? And as you were talking about, the cultural responsibility for understanding what we are invoking, my fear is that if people are not even, if people don't have the muscles for mortality, right, for communal responsibility around really honoring the processes of dying, which white culture doesn't do well. And that's a very broad generalization, but then it's very easy to go to sort of a wishful thinking resurrection. It's not even, I don't think it's even, it's not even, it's barely a theology, but it's this idea of, but I'll die and all will be fine, right? I mean, it's this idea that if I've gone to church, I've done my thing, I'm promised I won't hurt, you know, and or they will be with me forever, but I don't know what they look for when they look for the resurrection of the dead, if they haven't dealt with the gritty reality of death. But when the gritty reality of death comes close, which it does in communities that are not as well resourced, then you naturally, there's a continuum between death and resurrection, from my perspective. But it's been so broken I was thinking this so clearly, now I'm being so inarticulate, but there's just, in so many white churches, there is such an inability to get to the place of acknowledging mortality and finitude, that resurrection becomes a hypothetical horizon that I'm entitled to. I mean, it's this weird,
Yeah.
I'm not saying it very well, but I think the ethnographic work people would have to do about claiming their ancestors and has to start with their willingness to be vulnerable.
Oh, and
Right.
Storm, let me just one thing to what he said, I just said, and when I said WASP church, I really do mean our tradition.
Oh, I know you do. Right.
Because there are, so like Episcopal churches, we're WASP churches. But in churches, in white churches, the Irish and the Italians in those churches are not as disconnected.
They're not.
From those,
For historical reasons,
right,
right?
from those practices
That's
and
right.
those things.
And the
So-
working class white people are not
and
as, I mean,
working,
it's.
right, so it's
true.
really like a culture that I
It's
mean.
cultural and class but, anyway, yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
go
not
ahead,
saying
Storm.
anything, sorry.
Yeah, this is such a great conversation. And I was thinking as Larry was talking too about some of the resources we use in pastoral theology around looking at genograms and having people go back and looking at their ancestors. And, you know, I have students in class that can trace their ancestors back to slaves and slaveholders.
Right.
But I was also thinking about we sometimes do like a professional genogram of like who are the voices of the dead that are speaking to us at this time, and you know, I come back and what's Bonhoeffer saying to us in this moment, or you know, if I did my genogram of voices, who would be on there? And I wonder how that might be different for our students as we hear who are the voices of the dead speaking to them. But as you were going on to talk, I was thinking about the work, you know, the Episcopal Church is doing, and I think other churches are doing, about looking back at our histories and the ways that we've heard the voices of the dead. And I was a bridge priest in a little congregation in Massachusetts for a while, who had responded to the call of the diocese to relook at their history in terms of anti-racism and in terms of particularly relationship with Indigenous persons. And they were a church that had been started by a southern summer resident of the community who had given the land for the church and had actually built the church, and the process of going back and looking at him differently, and hearing the reality that he was a summer resident from the South, and even though he had been involved in the fertilizer trade and that kind of thing, that he had been a slaveholder. And so on June, the first celebration of Juneteenth, we had as one of the readings in the liturgy, a little shockingly, but on the front of the bulletin also, a letter that of a woman who was enslaved writing to Joseph's story, Faye, about the redemption of her children from him. And that had come up in this re-looking at the history. And it really gave a kind of again, thinking about resurrection as how do we live out of justice, not just the beloved community or the final feast, but in this moment, and hearing a different voice from the dead, and just how powerful that was. But it really countered the kind of family narrative of, this church that had been this great gift. But again, that kind of sense of resurrection, you had to look at the scars to really appreciate what that meant, not just in terms of legacy of a building, but what does that mean in terms of the legacy of what we now need to be committed to kind of anti-racist practices in an ongoing way.
It's a really beautiful full circle to your reference to the accountability partners in the murals at St. John the Divine, or St. John. Because that feels like a living resurrection accountability. When we excavate that history and people become human again, or for the first time, and then we become accountable to them as living witnesses to the present.
Yes.
And it changes the narrative forever. You can't forget that when it's a face and a name and a story.
Right. Yeah, I spent a lot of time in the Southwest and, of course, learn more and more and more about, our churches and many other churches' history in Native American schools, Indian schools, and the, gradual land grabbing and other things that went on there, and of course, all over the country. And one of my friends there says, Larry, you got a lot of white guilt. And I say back, no, it's accountability. I don't feel guilty about it. I'm a little ashamed that some of those might have been my fellow Presbyterians, but it tell the story for the accountability reason. And that means being accountable for how to move forward in a different way. And not that guilt doesn't occasionally have positive outcomes, it does, but yeah. And I like that story and imagery of accountability. It's very important.
So I'm looking at the time, and I don't know if folks have a last thing that they want to say. I have a very last thing I want to say, an announcement. But if there are last thoughts that people want to share.
I'm just really grateful to you, Kyle.
Yes.
I needed to dive back into
So
thinking.
rich, wasn't it?
Maybe just one last comment. I mean, I think here speaking as an ethnographer, my sense is that the dead are here.
Yeah.
The dead are present. And they can be here in lots of different ways. They can be here as healer or as haunt. But it doesn't help any of us to deny their presence. So,
or to romanticize them.
Yeah, right. Or to act as though they're not what they are and were. So, I mean, I think to Larry's point, and resonating with many of your comments, our work then is healing and repair of land and lineage, like the sites at which these agents continue to reside. And that's work that each of us have to do. And Storm, I love that geneogram image. And so my icon here behind Larry of the Jesuits is from a cloud of witnesses that's on my wall in my office. These are the folks that have shaped who I am and that I want to be seen and held accountable to Storm's language, community of accountability. And I think we all have work to do to repair. These are human people.
Yeah.
Fallen people, finite people, that God chose to work through in really powerful ways. So yeah, I'm just so grateful for this really rich conversation and the opportunity to think and pray with each of you. So thank you.
Thank you.
And it was lovely to meet you, Dr. Smallwood. I had not had the privilege. So even if it's this way, it just motivates us to find another way to get together. But thank you so much, all of you. Thanks, Kyle, for your great work. And have a good afternoon, everybody.
And thank you for organizing this.
Yeah.